Do we all really understand the point of the EU AI Act? There is a story about the European Union and artificial intelligence that we hear all the time. Europe is falling behind, America builds the models, China builds the infrastructure, and Europe writes regulations, thousands of pages of regulation, compliance requirements, risk classifications, documentation, transparency rules. So the conclusion seems obvious. Europe doesn't know how to compete in AI, so it's trying to regulate it instead. And honestly, I understand why people think this. If you look at the AI race from the outside, it can certainly look that way. But I think there is a much more interesting story underneath it. Because if you actually look at what the EU AI Act is trying to do, you start to realize that this isn't simply a law about technology. There's also a law about how humans behave when technology becomes extremely convincing. And that distinction matters because perhaps the biggest danger of AI isn't that machines will become too intelligent. Perhaps it's that we will become too willing to believe them. And that's what I want to explore today. The problem isn't only that AI can be wrong. Let's start with something very simple. Imagine you ask ChatGPT a difficult question. You get an answer. It's beautifully structured. The grammar is perfect. The vocabulary is sophisticated. There are headings, bullet points, examples, maybe even references. And most importantly, it sounds confident. It doesn't sit there saying, well, I'm not completely sure. It doesn't look nervous. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't look confused, it simply gives you an answer. And this creates a very interesting psychological problem because fluency feels like competence. When information is easy to process, well structured, and confidently presented, we can become more likely to accept it. And this isn't something AI invented. Human beings have always been vulnerable to it. We tend to associate confidence with competence. We tend to associate clarity with correctness. And we often confuse something that sounds right with something that is right. AI just happens to be extraordinarily good at producing language that sounds right. And this creates a very unusual situation. For centuries, if somebody wants to persuade you, they needed to be charismatic. They needed authority. They needed expertise. They needed social status. Now you can open a chatbot at 2 o'clock in the morning and ask it a question, and it will give you a beautifully written answer in 3 seconds. That is incredibly useful, but it is psychologically dangerous because the machine doesn't need to actually understand the truth in the human sense in order to produce something that sounds incredibly convincing. And this is where AI literacy becomes much more important than simply knowing how to write a good prompt. There is a concept in psychology and human factors research that I find extremely relevant here: automation bias. In simple terms, humans can become too willing to accept information or decisions generated by an automated system. And the more reliable that system appears to be, the easier it becomes to stop questioning it. Think about aviation. Modern aircraft are incredibly sophisticated. Pilots have access to enormous amounts of information. Autopilot systems can control huge parts of a flight, and this is obviously a good thing. Automation saves lives. It reduces workload. It performs calculations that would be impossible for a human to perform manually. But there is a paradox. The better automation becomes, the more important human oversight can become. Because if a system works correctly 99.9% of the time, humans can become less alert to 0.1% of situations where something goes wrong. The problem isn't necessarily the machine failed. The problem can become the machine failed and the human didn't notice. That is a completely different problem, and we have seen versions of this problem across aviation, medicine, industrial systems, and other high-risk environments. Technology doesn't remove human error. Sometimes it simply changes the form of human error. Instead of I made the wrong calculation, it becomes the system gave me an answer and I didn't challenge it. And this is where AI becomes particularly interesting because traditional automation often gives you a number. AI can give you an argument. It can explain itself. It can write a report. It can generate a recommendation. It can sound like a colleague. And that makes the psychological relationship between human and machine much more complicated. So what is the EU actually trying to do? This brings to the EU AI Act. The AI Act is often presented as Europe's attempt to control artificial intelligence, but that is not really the full picture. The Act takes a risk-based approach. Not every AI system is treated in the same way. Some practices are prohibited. Some systems are classified as high risk. Some systems have transparency obligations. And many ordinary AI applications are subject to much lighter requirements. The point is not AI is dangerous. The point is the consequences of using AI can be very different depending on what the AI is being used for. If AI recommends a funny restaurant, that is one thing. If AI helps decide whether somebody gets a job, a loan, access to education, or certain essential services, that is a very different situation. The consequences are much higher. And that is why the EU's regulatory approach becomes more demanding as the potential risk increases. Article 14 is where this gets really interesting. Now let's look at one of the most important concepts in the Act, human oversight. Article 14 requires high-risk AI systems to be designed so that they can be effectively overseen by human beings. And the purpose isn't simply to have a human physically sitting somewhere near a computer. The human needs to be able to understand the system sufficiently, monitor its operation, identify problems, and intervene when necessary. The regulation even talks about the ability to override or stop the system where appropriate. Think about what that means. The EU isn't saying AI must never make mistakes. That would be impossible anyways. Instead, it is saying something much more realistic. If an AI system is powerful enough to create serious consequences, humans cannot simply surrender control to it. That is a very different philosophy, and I think this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of AI regulation. The objective isn't necessarily to make AI perfect. It is to make sure that humans remain capable of questioning imperfect AI. Imagine this in a workplace. Let's say you're a manager. You have 500 CVs. You use an AI system to rank candidates. The system tells you candidate A 94%, candidate B 89%, candidate C 71%. Looks fantastic. You save hours. But now imagine that the system has learned patterns from historical hiring decisions that contain bias. The AI isn't necessarily saying, I don't like this person. It simply produces a ranking, and because the ranking looks mathematical and objective, you might trust it even more than you would trust another human being. That is the dangerous part. The machine doesn't have to say, trust me. Its interface can say it for us. A percentage can look objective. A ranking can look scientific. A polished explanation can look authoritative. And suddenly, the human being who was supposed to supervise the system becomes the person defending the system's decision. That is automation bias. And that's why human oversight isn't just about putting a human somewhere in the process. The human has to remain capable of saying, no, this doesn't make sense. Let's investigate. Let's look at the original evidence. Let's not use this output. That is what meaningful human oversight should look like. And then there is Article 4, AI literacy. So now we get to another part of the AI Act that I think is extremely important. And this is where I think many people misunderstand what AI literacy actually means. When you hear AI literacy online, what do you usually say? 10 ChatGPT prompts you need to know, 5 AI tools that will replace your job, how to make presentations in 30 seconds, how to write the perfect prompt, how to automate your entire business. That is useful, but that's not the whole story. The EU's concept of AI literacy is much broader. The current framework requires providers and deployers of AI systems to take measures to support the AI literacy of staff and other people dealing with AI systems on their behalf, taking into account their knowledge, experience, education, training, and the context in which the AI system is used. And this is important because AI literacy isn't simply, can you use AI? It is also, do you understand when you should be careful using AI? Can you recognize its limitations? Can you recognize when an output might be unreliable? Can you understand the risks associated with the particular AI system you are using? Can you understand when human judgment needs to remain in control? That is a very different definition of literacy. AI literacy is not just about becoming better at AI. And here is where I think the conversation becomes much more interesting. We normally think education makes us better at using technology, but with AI, education also needs to make us better at resisting technology when necessary. That is a subtle difference. Imagine a doctor using an AI system to assist with diagnosis. AI can be incredibly useful. It can identify patterns. It can analyze images. It can help prioritize information. But the doctor still needs enough knowledge to recognize this output doesn't make sense. Otherwise, the human becomes a rubber stamp. The same thing applies to finance. The same thing applies to recruitment. The same thing applies to education. The same thing applies to law. And eventually, it applies to almost every knowledge-based profession. The more capable AI becomes, the less useful it is to simply know how to operate the interface. You need to understand where the system ends and your responsibility begins. This is why I think the AI Act is more important than people realize. Because people often ask, why does Europe need all these AI regulations? And my answer would be because AI isn't just another piece of software. Software traditionally executes instructions. AI systems increasingly produce outputs that humans use to make decisions. And when those decisions affect human beings, the question isn't only does the model work, the question becomes who is responsible when it doesn't? That's a much deeper question, and the AI Act is part of Europe's attempt to answer it. But let's be fair to the critics. Now, I don't want this video to become EU good, AI regulation good, end of story, because there are legitimate criticisms. Regulation can create compliance costs, it can create uncertainty, it can slow down certain deployments, it can be difficult for smaller companies to navigate, and if regulation becomes too rigid, it can absolutely create problems for innovation. So the EU itself recognizes the need to simplify implementation and make the regulatory framework more innovation friendly. The rules and timelines have also been changing, including recent amendments affecting AI literacy and the implementation timeline for high-risk AI systems. So the debate isn't regulation versus innovation. The real question is, how much regulation do we need to make powerful technology trustworthy without making it impossible to build? And I don't think anyone has completely solved that problem yet. But there is one thing I think we should take seriously. We shouldn't judge AI regulation only by asking, does this make it harder for companies to build AI? We should also ask, what happens if everyone becomes incredibly good at using AI, but nobody becomes good at questioning it? Because that's a very different feature. Imagine a workplace where everyone uses AI, everyone writes faster, everyone analyzes faster, everyone creates presentations faster, everyone produces reports faster, but nobody checks the underlying assumptions. Nobody verifies the sources. Nobody asks whether the recommendation makes sense. Nobody knows when the model is outside its area of competence. You could end up with a workplace that is incredibly productive and incredibly wrong. That is the paradox. AI can increase the speed of decision making without necessarily increasing the quality of decisions. Sometimes it can even do the opposite. So, what does real AI literacy look like? For me, it comes down to 5 questions. Number one, what is this system actually designed to do? Don't assume that general purpose AI is equally reliable at everything. Number two, what are its limitations? What kind of errors does it make? What information does it have access to? What doesn't it know? Number three, how confident should I be in this particular output? A confident sentence isn't evidence. A beautifully written paragraph isn't evidence. A percentage isn't automatically evidence. Number four, what happens if this answer is wrong? This is perhaps the most important question. If we're asking AI to recommend a restaurant, the consequences are tiny. If we're asking it to help decide whether somebody gets a mortgage, a job, or medical treatment, the consequences are completely different. And number five, when should I stop using the AI? and make the decision myself? That is a question we don't talk about enough. So let's go back to the question we started with. Do we really understand the point of the EU AI Act? Maybe it's not simply about Europe trying to slow down artificial intelligence. Maybe it's not simply about bureaucrats writing thousands of pages while Silicon Valley builds the future. Maybe the deeper idea is this. As AI becomes more capable, we need to protect something that is much older than artificial intelligence: human judgment. Machines have already taken over parts of our physical labor. Computers took over enormous amounts of our memory and calculation. AI is moving into something much more sensitive, our reasoning. And that changes the relationship completely. The greatest danger isn't necessarily that AI will become smarter than us. The danger is that we will become so comfortable with AI being smarter, faster, and more articulate than us that we stop exercising our own judgment. We stop checking, we stop questioning, we stop saying, prove it. Where did that come from? Are you sure? What if you're wrong? And perhaps that's why concepts like AI literacy and human oversight matter so much. Not because Europe thinks AI is evil, not because AI should never be trusted, but because trust without understanding is dangerous. The goal shouldn't be to distrust AI. It should be to know when trust is justified and when it isn't. So the next time somebody tells you the EU AI Act is just Europe trying to regulate technology because it can't compete, I would ask them to look a little deeper, because perhaps the most important question isn't, can we build intelligent machines? We are already doing that. The harder question is, can we remain intelligent decision makers while using them? And I think that is the conversation we should be having. I'll see you in the next video.